Good morning, everyone. It is 10 a.m., so we will get started. My name is Henry McKay. I am the Pennsylvania Program Director for Solar United Neighbors, and thanks for joining our Community Solar webinar today. Also joining me here is my colleague, Corey Ramsden. He's our Vice President of Go Solar Programs at Solar United Neighbors. So if you don't know us already, Solar United Neighbors, we are a nonprofit organization that helps people go solar. And we see community solar as a way to help many more people go solar and really broaden access to those benefits of solar energy. We were one of the groups leading the charge to create the community solar pilot program that's going on right now in Maryland. And so what we're doing here today is talking about community solar in general, talking about our experiences in Maryland, and talking about how we might be able to help create something similar, a community solar program here in Pennsylvania. And I hope this webinar to be the first in a series of materials and resources that we provide to help build a conversation around community solar in Pennsylvania. So stay tuned for more from us in the future. And right now I'm going to hand things over to Corey.
Thanks, Henry. So again, I'm Corey Ramsden. I'm the VP for Go Solar Programs at Solar United Neighbors, which really just means I get to work with all of our state programs to implement projects on the ground with state directors to help people connect to the renewable energy economy. So we do that in a couple different states, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. Just wanted to let you know the presentation will probably run around 40 minutes or so. We'll leave time for Q&A. If you decide you have a question along the way, feel free to use the Q&A feature on the toolbar that should be at the top of your screen there. And we'll be on the lookout for some of those questions along the presentation. We may hold some of them towards the end or to a later point, but feel free to send those off to us whenever you think of them. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about 4 different things today, just a little bit about who we are and a little more in detail, just so folks have an understanding of where we're coming from. And then some community solar basics broadly, and then we'll dive into Maryland and talk a little bit more about what it takes to make these types of programs a reality in states where they're not currently available. So Solar United Neighbors, at the end of the day, we are not just a nonprofit, we're actually a network of people who are producing their own electricity throughout the states where we work. These are individuals, businesses who have come together, often in the form of a co-op, excuse me, who have worked collectively to reduce their barriers to going solar directly in the marketplace in all the states where we operate. So what we do, generally speaking, is we work with rooftop homeowners who are interested in installing solar on their property. And historically, that's been a very effective way for us to expand the number of people who directly interact with the energy economy. And community solar, as Henry said, is another way for us to expand that audience even further. So that's a little bit about why we care. But really, it got started back in 2007. Our executive director, Anya Skolman, went to go see the movie An Inconvenient Truth with her son. That's him there on the left, and his friend. And they came back. The boys wanted to do something about climate change. That was their particular why. Lots of reasons why people go solar, but that was theirs. And they asked their Anya whether or not they could do something about it. And what can we do? And they decided ultimately, let's go solar. Did some research, did a lot of investigation. This is in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and found out there were a lot of incentives and, missing incentives, a lot of confusion, not a lot of providers, and generally just a landscape that was difficult for a typical homeowner to navigate. So Anya tasked the boys with trying to find some other people who were interested. They're going to do this. Let's do this as a group, she said. About 2 weeks later, they knocked on doors, they handed out flyers, and they had about 40 people that ultimately joined that group and what became the Mount Pleasant Solar Cooperative. Really, individuals using their collective buying power, their collective ability to educate each other and navigate the process of going solar to make it easier for everybody. And that's really the kernel of what we still do today. We operate solar co-op programs in 8 states and the District of Columbia, including Pennsylvania now. And in addition to these rooftop and ground-based solar programs, we're also expanding the work that we do to bring solar to more people. So this is where community solar comes in for this particular topic. Before we get into that a little bit though, just a kind of a little background here. This may be repetition for some of you, but what makes a good roof for solar? When you're talking about a property, you really want there to be solar access for the property somewhere between 9 and 3 and have it face a southerly direction with not a lot of shade, right? So that means that not even every homeowner is going to be able to install solar on their roof. It also means that there's a number of folks out there who are left entirely out of the conversation when it comes to rooftop solar. Folks in apartment buildings, roofs that are in poor condition, people that maybe aren't able to finance a full-size system, as well as other considerations about property. Those are things that prevent people from directly connecting with the renewable energy economy. At the end of the day, the more people who can connect, these are more people who are going to be advocates for clean energy broadly in a state or in a region. So what we see this as really is a missed opportunity. And it's just the stat here from NREL, I think sums it up pretty well, just in terms of the number of individuals and businesses who can't go solar directly. That is a tremendous amount of people who otherwise could be strong advocates for clean energy if given the chance to directly participate and benefit. That, at the end of the day, is what community solar is. It's another opportunity for people to get the benefits of solar energy, hopefully reduce their cost of electricity, and connect to an economy that's growing, creating jobs and creating economic value across the country. And community solar is one way that they can do that. So what's the alternative? As I said, community solar, right? This is for anybody who can't go solar directly, or in fact, people who can. Many of these programs support being able to install solar on a building and supplement it with a community solar subscription. And we'll dig into that a little bit more in a little bit. But really, this is an opportunity to have an electricity supply that comes from a local installation of solar and have it be directly credited onto your electricity bill. So we're really talking about is sharing solar. This image, I think, is it's a simple one, but I think it does justice to the fact that you're taking an array that's located somewhere else in your area. Exactly where and how far away depends on the regulations that come about in a particular state. But at the end of the day, you're taking some percentage of your electricity production and you're splitting it up from that array and sharing it across multiple participants. People might buy by the panel, they might buy by the kilowatt hour, but at the end of the day, they're taking part of it. Other people are taking another part of that energy output. What this means really is that you're sharing solar. You're in some places they're called solar gardens. We prefer to use the term community shared solar just because we think it's a little more clear. It has that term of community in it, which is really important, and that you're sharing that across a number of participants. It's going to be installed somewhere other than where you live specifically, but it might be down the street. It might be on a large building nearby. It might be in a field. All of those are possible. It might be in a brownfield, for example, or on a parking lot in church. And it's proportional, right? You're not getting all of it or none of it, which means that you can potentially subscribe to a smaller amount than you might need to make a system viable for your rooftop. Or if you only need a couple of kilowatts worth of energy production for your apartment, you can do that and still get the benefits of the economies of scale of a larger system. And then there's a mechanism that works differently in different states, but generally speaking, you are taking those kilowatt hours that come from that array, and you are virtually applying them to your electricity bill. The utility is the one doing that. There's some coordination that happens between the community solar operator and the utility, but at the end of the month, you would see a reduction in your kilowatt hour or your dollar amount on your bill because you've subscribed to some array somewhere else, your community solar array. In many ways, this is a complement to rooftop. It's not really a replacement necessarily. A lot of folks feel strongly about putting solar on their property, generating their own electricity. We don't see community solar as an alternative, more as something that is one more. It's both and for the renewable energy landscape in a state. And really, it's an opportunity not only to reduce electricity bills, but also to expand the number of participants and also wealth generation. So when you are producing electricity in your area, you are creating jobs, you are producing economic benefit for the people in that community. And these are some of the reasons why. I've got a few more listed up here. Obviously, cheaper electricity is important, and these are projects can be 20 to 25 years long. So there's the potential for an extended period of reducing electricity costs for participants. But really, it's also about equity of access to solar. I mentioned that earlier, that for various reasons, people can't connect to the renewable energy economy. This is a way to address that for everyone else in the state, with good regulations and a program that works economically for participants and for developers, and for anybody who out there who wants to put one of these projects together. We're really talking about making solar available to anybody and everyone in a region or in an area. One other thing that we want to mention here, and this is, I think, our perspective on it, is this is an opportunity for community-based power. There are lots of different ways programs can be constructed, but when community solar is implemented in a way that allows a variety of different projects to happen, this is one more way where individuals and businesses can have decision-making power on where their electricity comes from and who benefits from it. We've seen in Maryland so far, a couple different varieties of projects, but they're anywhere from small rooftop projects up to large multi-megawatt projects. Having that variety is important, and we feel that community solar is a way really to empower individuals and organizations and communities to create electricity from renewable sources in their community, and to do it in a way that makes economic sense for them broadly. So let's talk a little bit more about some of those benefits. We are looking at different areas where community solar can be implemented, and you'll often see a little bit of a dividing line there between an urban area where individuals maybe can't access solar directly because of their property, and rural areas where there's a lot of space, maybe there are fewer people, but it's important to note that there actually are benefits for both areas there. When you're looking at the urban areas, you're really talking about enabling people to access solar that couldn't otherwise, and the value of that solar energy, right? We don't want to leave anybody behind as the renewable energy economy changes the way that our electricity sector works. Community solar can help with that. But on the rural side, you'll also see other benefits that are happening there. Not only those two that I just mentioned, but also benefits for folks who are hosting these facilities, providing revenue streams potentially for farmers who are able to get a consistent source of revenue from hosting a facility and still work their land or their productive farmland. That's one way where we can help farms and agricultural businesses maintain viability in the long run by providing that consistent revenue. And if done right, it can also reinforce the agricultural fabric. You see this picture on the left here, an organization called Fresh Energy. They do a lot of work in Minnesota and other parts of the country. And we've certainly been following their work and trying to speak about it in the states where we work as well, to integrate pollinators, for example, into ground-based systems. So one way where you can have the solar array reinforce the environment that's around it, providing a habitat for bees and creating the array, making the array more fit into the fabric of the agricultural community that it exists in. The other things that I didn't mention yet is tax revenue. When done right with a local municipality and planned for and expected that community solar will happen, it can actually create a source of tax revenue as well. So we've seen, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we've seen in a lot of these situations where community solar has shown up without preparation, it does cause knee-jerk reactions from local jurisdictions. It's new, they don't know what it is. So getting people prepared for what it is and the benefits of it is a really important step in bringing community solar to a new area. Broadly across the country, just I'll let this map speak for itself, but you can see that community solar is certainly expanding. We would love to see it come to Pennsylvania and to the other states where we operate, where it doesn't exist yet. And it really has taken off over the last couple of years in terms of the number of states, but also the number of projects and the number of people who can access it. Minnesota, for example, one of the earlier states to adopt community solar, has multi-megawatt projects across the state that are providing shared electricity from renewable sources, from solar in particular, to people all over the state. And we'd love to see that happen in Pennsylvania. It's starting to happen, it will sometime this year in Maryland, and we'll cover that in a little bit, and in all these other states as well. Each one of these programs operates a little bit differently. And when I dig into Maryland, I'll go into that a little bit more about how that program functions. But keep in mind, these programs are developed at the state level. So there's a lot of variation that's possible. And some of the programs that came after the initial ones have tried to learn from some of the things that that happened in those first rounds, like Colorado, for example, and Minnesota. Maryland came after that, tried to learn from some of those situations that came up with regard to getting access to the program and things like that. So those are ways that the community solar across the country is starting to change and really to become a better and better program over time. We do want to draw a distinction in terms of the types of community solar. We've broken it down here into just the two general categories, which is utility owned, as you see, or third party owned or competitive. There are a lot of programs out there that are in utility territories that are not established by state law, but are run by those utilities. They are contracting, creating facilities. They might sub out that work to someone else and offering subscriptions to their to their customers. If it's a co-op, to their members, or to a municipal utility potentially. This certainly is a great option for folks in those areas. They can often be constructed in a way that produce value for the subscribers, for the customers. But from our perspective, it's not fully community solar because there is no opportunity for individuals, businesses, organizations, and other third parties to create energy production from local sources and make it available to communities directly. So we would love to see more opportunities for that to happen across the country, and certainly in Pennsylvania, where anyone can create a project and sell the energy and potentially be an owner of that project, depending on the model. So when you do that, communities have more control over what a project looks like, where it's located, who benefits, and how. These projects can be privately owned, they could be owned by a nonprofit, or even by a municipality. So having that flexibility to have multiple actors participating in the marketplace, we think is really important. Let's transition a little bit into why, in terms of what you're going to see from it, right? Bill savings is something we want to point out is ideally there's going to be savings there from one of these projects, but it's not guaranteed. We do a lot of consumer education across Maryland and other states where there's community solar about what is a good deal, right? We do this for rooftop solar as well. What's the price? Does the cost go up over time? How does it compare to utility cost of electricity? The savings is going to really be the difference between the retail rate of what you're paying with your electricity company and that solar credit rate, whatever that is, over time, whether it's fixed or whether that cost of electricity is going to rise with something called an escalator. So just something to keep in the back of your mind, especially when it comes to making solar available to low and moderate income communities. It's really important to ensure that the program is able to deliver savings to those communities, meaningful savings, so that it can be adopted and actually benefit those who are qualified for lower moderate income, however the state defines that. So something to keep in mind as you're thinking about programs for Pennsylvania. So let's hop into Maryland here. For context, in Maryland, we actually have worked for a number of years trying to come up with good opportunities for community solar in the state. And we ended up doing experiments with communities who wanted to do programs before there was a state program that even existed. And what that meant was really a very kind of complex setup of a limited liability corporation and people taking shares and ownership. This was probably 2012 that we originally did this work with a couple of communities in Maryland. But what it did was show the need for community solar broadly to be able to start talking to legislators and ultimately pass, with a lot of help from other individuals and organizations throughout the state, in 2015, a law that made community solar available statewide. I'll pause just for a question here. It looks like we have a question on countering the utility argument that net metering, by allowing solar owners to avoid distribution charges, causes non-solar customers to subsidize their solar customers. So that's a great question. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we're talking about the Maryland program. That is just for context for folks. When there's discussion about community solar, one of the arguments that often gets raised is because the array is not on your home, it's somewhere else on the distribution grid, that there's a subsidy applied there for the transfer of that electricity from where it is to whoever's using it. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but because that electricity is going to go wherever it's needed, as close to the array as possible. But there certainly is something to be said for the fact that the distribution grid is being used. The position that we've taken, and we've seen others take as well, is it doesn't really make sense to have that conversation unless there is a real review of the full costs and benefits of solar on a distribution grid. And in the meantime, until that happens for states, so community solar is an opportunity to provide that equity of access that has not existed previously. So solving that problem can be done separately from that other conversation until it can be had more fully and clear in an open, transparent manner. For somebody to say that there's a surplus there, there's a transfer or a subsidization of those costs, is just a very simplistic way of looking at it. That reality you can't gauge correctly unless you look at those costs and benefits across the entire electricity sector for that area. So you be prepared for those questions, be prepared for that kind of response from folks, and know that it is a much more complex answer than being able to just say we're subsidizing, therefore we shouldn't do it. Great question. So in Maryland, I'm going to go over a couple of terms here about the kind of the structure, and I just wanted to say before we do this, the state can really put your, you can create whatever program you like for community solar. There's going to be lots of different options there. The way that it works in Maryland is that there is a subscriber organization entity that owns and operates the facility. That subscriber organization is the one that is going out and working with individuals and signing them up, or organizations, to use that electricity on their bill, right? So they're going to offer a contract for some number of years with some terms to purchase electricity from that facility. And then once they're signed up as customers and that facility is online, that subscriber organization then works with the utility to make sure that those credits are applied. The utility receives the electricity itself from the array and distributes it on the distribution grid like it would any other source of electricity. But that virtual crediting of the production and applying it to the bill, that mechanism is something that community solar has to set up, so that the utility is required to take a percentage of those kilowatt hours from a facility and apply it to customer X as a credit on their bill, however that credit is defined. Got another question here. So as a community solar investor, doesn't get as much savings per kilowatt hour as someone with their own solar panels utilizing net metering. Is that correct? So the question, I think, really is talking about whether or not the savings is comparable to whether or not you have solar on your roof and what that looks like in terms of a lower cost of electricity. And really that comes down to the model of the subscriber organization, what they're offering, or how that facility is constructed and financed. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. I've got a little bit of information in terms of the types of models that you might see. But at the end of the day, if you are not investing money up front, you're probably going to get a lower return. Just like a solar PPA, you might pay 12 cents per kilowatt hour instead of 14 cents. That savings is going to accumulate less than if you were to purchase your system and have all of that energy that comes from it come off of your electricity bill every month. The same thing is true for community solar. It just depends on the options that are available in your market and what the structure of those are. So I know it's kind of an odd answer, but I guess the end of the day, it depends on the ownership versus purchasing electricity options you have. So how it works in Maryland, couple of key points to note here. And this goes back to this previous question. The ownership models are not defined here. You can have a third-party owner that might be financing and operating the system and selling electricity, kilowatt hours, Or you might have a direct owner model. We haven't seen too many of that of those in Maryland yet, but individuals can certainly come together and create a facility, use the law to be able to distribute that energy to all of their participants. That's a harder way to organize a project, but it certainly has the potential to keep more of the value with the participants and in the community. I'll give you a small example there. We have a homeowner we've worked with in Baltimore. They have a rental property. They wanted to use the roof to be able to distribute that electricity to themselves, to the rental property, and to their sister who lives somewhere else in the utility territory. They financed the system, they installed it, they are just about to turn it on, and when they do, they'll have a small community solar facility. I think it's about 10 kilowatts, but it totally is in the spirit of the law. He was able to use roof space he had access to benefit the electricity consumption of 3 different meters, all of which he had some relationship with. But that's an example of a direct ownership model where there's no third party owning and operating it. It's just one person taking advantage of the community solar law to be able to provide their house with electricity where they couldn't otherwise. This particular person's house didn't have a great roof for solar, but his rental property did. So that's just one example of how it can work on a small scale. Maryland program also has something else going for it, which is that full retail credit. That means that for all kilowatt hour charges or all volumetric charges, the kilowatt hours that are produced by a facility will get credited at that full rate on your electricity bill. That means the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. That's important for the program because it provides an equal level of value for someone participating in community solar, just like rooftop solar. So we're not treating a community solar subscriber as a second-class citizen. We're giving them the same experience as if they had solar on their rooftop. That was one of the main points of contention in the Maryland program as it developed, but it was put into the program and is a key component of it. Next is your subscription levels. In Maryland, the net metering laws allow you to install up to 200% of your annual usage in solar production. And because this community solar pilot is underneath the net metering program, they adopted that same rule, which means that you can get up to full retail credit up to 100% of your electricity usage. If you decide to subscribe to more than 100%, anything above that will be credited at a lesser rate, which is essentially the generation rate for that electricity. But it does match the rooftop experience there. That's something that you have to decide for a program in Pennsylvania, how that would work. But in this case, it mirrors the rooftop program. And as I mentioned earlier, you do have options to install solar on site as well as community solar. There's no limitation there. You can even subscribe to multiple community solar facilities if you wanted to. Some other things that we personally think are important for the Maryland program is that there is direct support for low and moderate income access. Now, what that means is the legislature specifically put this in the law to be able to encourage access by the LMI community in in Maryland, and they left it up to the Public Service Commission to decide how to do that. Ultimately, they ended up selecting a way of encouraging projects by using the scarce resource of space in the project. This is a pilot program. So there's only about 196 megawatts roughly of space over 3 years. And they sectioned off a portion of the program to be able to be dedicated to projects that had at least 30% subscription of the kilowatt hour output for folks who are qualified low and moderate income. In Maryland, that's defined as 175% of the federal poverty line for low income and 80% of state median income for moderate income. But those definitions can vary. I will say that and I'll talk about this more in the next slide, is that while the program encourages access, it doesn't do a lot other than creating that scarce resource. So there's some gaps there, and I'll come back to that. Second, there's support for small non-traditional projects. I gave you that example earlier of the person with solar on their roof who wanted to split it on their rental property. From our perspective, we definitely don't want to limit or prevent those projects from happening. Community solar has the potential to create a lot of different models, a lot of different opportunities for community-owned and local energy resources. So it's important that the legislation and the regulations don't prohibit that. The most common model is going to be a larger scale model where it's multi-megawatt and you're offering electricity by the kilowatt hour, which is fine, but that shouldn't prevent communities from creating smaller projects potentially for their own benefit with less interaction from large financing partners or developers if they want to do that. So Maryland program is agnostic on that and actually has some support to encourage those small projects. The other thing is, because this is a pilot program, they felt it was important to be able to make sure that projects were scattered throughout the state. So they chose to give access to the program, which is a pilot and is limited, to every utility territory by the amount of electricity, the demand in that territory. We would love to have seen an open program and just have it be permanent, but the reality of passing it in Maryland was that the pilot program was the way that it got through the legislature, and the experimentation part of it was an important part of that conversation. They ultimately came up with a way by segmenting the space in the program by utility area. And then the last, which is pretty extensive in the Maryland regulations, are clear consumer protection requirements. Now, what do I mean by that? Contract disclosures, what information has to be present, how agents for providers are supposed to be trained and interact and identify themselves with customers. This is, and I think an important point that gets missed sometimes, is that in states, especially states where there is retail electricity supply for deregulated states, it is, community solar can feel a lot like retail electricity supply. So it can be confusing for people. And in some places, retail electricity supply does not have the best reputation because of some of the ways that it's been marketed in the past by some providers. So preparing people that community solar is different, and making sure that those disclosures and those protections are there is an important part of the program. You don't want it to be too onerous, but you do want to make sure that that information is available to customers and is required to be presented by the developers who are working on these projects. Most of whom are perfectly happy to do that, but it should just be clear and spelled out. And Maryland does a good job of that. A couple places where the Maryland program probably could be better based on our experience is, as I mentioned earlier, it does not provide any specific supports for some of the issues you run across when trying to include low and moderate income participants in community solar projects. So other states, for example, have considered or adopted a slightly higher credit rate for low and moderate income subscribers as a way to create more value. In other places, you might find that there are protections for, that there are support for financing, so that what's perceived as a credit risk for financiers, low and moderate income participants, might be perceived as a credit risk because they could be more likely to default. That's an open question, but financing may see that as an issue. Providing some mechanism to backstop that can be an important way to encourage that project development. Just a question here. Somebody's asking about sending links to the Maryland laws for consumer protection. Happy to do that. I will make a note. Actually, Henry, if you could just jot that note down, we will make sure that we post those as well. They're in the regulations that were developed by the Public Service Commission. And all those links are on our website as well, but we'll make sure they get out to the group. So second thing, area improvement, it's a pilot with limited capacity. We would have loved to see this be an open program. We now have to go back and try to get this renewed again in a couple of years based on the success of the pilot, but it was just the reality of the legislative process that in order to get it through, it needed to be a pilot and not be a permanent program. So we have been working, and a lot of others have been working to make sure that the program is a successful one, and that turning it into a permanent program will be easier when the time is up in a couple of years. The third item here, system size less than recommended 5 megawatts. What I mean by this is the Maryland program, because it's under the net metering program, has a 2 megawatt cap, which is the cap for net metering in the state and state regulations. But from what we've heard from developers and from industry is that there are some economies of scale to go a little bit higher than that. So getting the limit for community solar projects to a larger amount is potentially helpful. this is also just a way to kind of underscore that you, as you're developing community solar across the state and plans to implement it, it's really important to work collaboratively with the development community. They can provide a lot of technical guidance on what makes a good program. Not all of it's going to be the same thing that community organizations might care about, but for situations like this, it's a really great way to get some perspective on where the market is and what, for example, whether 5 megawatts might be a better limit or some other number as opposed to 2 megawatts in the Maryland case. So long story short, important to interact and to really partner with industry to make sure you've got the right technical components of a potential bill. Got another question here. How can we ensure cost savings for LMI customers? That is a great question, and it is one that I think is probably still dogs most of the country who has community solar. I think it can be done a number of different ways. The most direct one is making sure that there is a frank discussion about the crediting mechanism for community solar in the state, whether that is increasing the amount of credit that's available for folks who are low and moderate income qualified, or even as simple as making sure that there is some sort of on-bill recovery for subscriptions. One thing we've heard from developers is that it can be a challenge, and as you might imagine, presenting another bill to somebody, one to the subscriber organization and one to your utility company, is just a really difficult sell, especially for LMI individuals. So having that single bill is really an important way to make sure that the project can come off and potentially improve the savings of it. But so crediting mechanisms is one, and then I think the other is just finding ways to reduce the cost of capital to finance these projects. And we don't have a strong financing background, so I can't speak directly to that, but I know that in Maryland, for example, there are some organizations who are trying to provide loan guarantees, loans backup for defaults for these projects for folks who are trying to include low and moderate income subscribers. That in theory should reduce the cost of capital and hopefully provide a better savings. But some of it just has to be an explicit conversation up front as you're creating these laws and regulations to make sure that meaningful savings does actually happen. Next, the last one here, statewide outreach on education and zoning. This one we are living in kind of a painful way in Maryland right now, and it's one that's totally preventable. In the state, we have seen that there are a number of jurisdictions who have seen these projects show up, and they have essentially put moratoriums in place or reviewed zoning in a way that has not been conducive to developing projects. Really what this means is just getting in front of local jurisdictional officials before the program launches, explaining what community solar is, explaining how ground-based solar is cited, working through a lot of the best practices that are already out there, and really preparing people for community solar before it shows up. I can't stress this enough, this is really important. Maryland, we spent a lot of time with legislation and regulations and almost no time on the state level educating jurisdictions. And because of that, there are certain parts of the state where it's just difficult to impossible to develop solar on the ground because of very local jurisdictional issues. In terms of the standards, there are a number of good resources out there that we're putting together a page of resources in the next couple of weeks on our site. The industry also has a number of these resources. The Coalition for Community Solar Access, for example, which is a trade group nationwide, has a lot of these resources as well. But what it comes down to really is individual outreach at the jurisdictional level with permitting and zoning officials and county officials, explaining that this has been done before. There are common things to look out for, and really to also provide an opportunity to listen to local concerns about siting, because they're going to vary by jurisdiction in terms of whether it's a heavily agricultural area or whether there are other concerns that are very local, and to find the solution that works for those areas. So good question. Somebody had asked about land use standards. I think that's probably a little more detail than we can get into on this call, but I think it is a great second or third presentation that we can do specifically on those land use issues, because there's some good solutions out there already. Got one other question here. What needs to happen Sorry about that. My question just disappeared.
Oh, sorry, I just answered it.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Thanks, Henry.
There's a question about what needs to happen for it to become legal in Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides.
Got it. Thank you. It's good to have help. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to mention just about Maryland specifically is that we feel really strongly about being able to have community-driven examples out there to show what community-owned energy can be and what that means really. And I'm happy to do another presentation on this later about community project development. It's definitely more complicated than having a developer and financing happen through third parties, but it does present an opportunity to keep more of that value in the community. And really what you're doing at the high level is aggregating demand, individuals and businesses who want to participate, potentially finding land partners, and then working with developers or even financing it directly if you have the resources to do that, maybe through a municipality or a business, and creating one of these projects on your own and making them happen in a community and keeping that value, as I said, more of that value with the community. Want to come back to this element. We talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this still, but as I said earlier, community solar is for everyone. It's about equity of access. In order to do that, we have to be intentional about addressing some of these issues, about reducing financial risk, loan loss reserve options, potentially for project development. Consistent consumer education, which I mentioned earlier, is really important in the LMI community. Just to give you an example, in Baltimore, there have been tons of kind of negative stories in communities about retail electricity supply, people signing up for electricity offering and then a year later their bill going through the roof. This looks and feels a lot like that. If you have those situations in Pennsylvania, you want to get ahead of that. You don't want the marketplace to have offerings that feels like something that has already caused problems in a community and have people be resistant to it just because of that experience, especially when it has the potential to deliver real value and maximize savings. So being intentional and working with local organizations to get ahead of that is really important. This next one here, income verification requirements. Being specific at the regulatory level about how to income verify folks who are participating, but also providing methods at the state level to make that process easy for developers. And whether it's a categorical eligibility or a proxy eligibility with a state program, or providing a state portal to verify people so that developers don't have to collect paperwork, something to make that process easier is really important to do. Just to give you two different examples, in Maryland that doesn't exist, or there's actually no income verification requirements right now. We're still waiting for them. Washington, D.C. has a program that's not exactly the same, but they've chosen to use their LIHEAP portal to qualify people, not because everyone qualifies for LIHEAP who's participating in the program, but because it is an existing technology solution that the state controls that they're able to leverage to do income verifications. Lots of bugs to be worked out along the way, like any other state program or offering, but thinking about that ahead of time is important, and potentially looking for ways to make that process easier to develop for developers is going to make access easier in the long run. And last, we've talked about that enough, but maybe I should stress it one more time. Maximizing savings, real savings for participants, low and moderate income participants, in order to make this worth their while and worth the developer's while. Really important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Henry, and he's going to talk a little bit more specifically about Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, so what about Pennsylvania? What's stopping us from doing this here? And basically, we don't have what's called virtual net metering in Pennsylvania. And this is for really widespread access to community solar. We need to enable virtual net metering. And as of now, as far as I know, no utilities in Pennsylvania have allowed this yet, because the state hasn't required them to allow virtual net metering like they have with traditional net metering. So virtual net metering, if you remember traditional net metering, so this is where someone owns solar, or they have solar installed on their property, and when they produce more electricity than they use on site, they can sell that excess back to the utility, back into the grid, and earn credits on their utility bill based on the value of that extra electricity. Virtual net metering is similar, except the solar panels themselves can be on another property, even owned, on another property, that property owned by someone else, and then they are virtually credited to multiple meters on multiple different properties owned by multiple property owners. Yeah, so we don't have virtual net metering in Pennsylvania. There are some kind of workarounds to community solar here that people have been exploring. You can do virtual net metering and community solar on a microgrid, and there's at least one project I know of in Philadelphia where they're taking this approach, but microgrids aren't particularly widespread, and so this isn't a way to really broaden access to community solar. Corey, can you go to the next slide? So how can we fix this? Well, an obvious quick fix for community solar would be just to have the state require that utilities allow virtual net metering, thereby technically enabling community solar projects. But really, for a better fix, to have the kind of comprehensive program that Corey's been talking about, that provides clear community benefits. We really need to see some kind of comprehensive enabling legislation that really designs a community solar program beyond just allowing that virtual net metering. So that comprehensive legislation might set rules about project size, about where those projects can be located and where in relation to their subscribers, how many subscribers can participate. That legislation might clarify how subscribers are credited on their electric bills. Is it at that full retail rate like someone who has solar panels on their roof? And then importantly, that legislation can provide for some kind of equitable participation by low and moderate income subscribers. So whether that's just creating a carve out and saying a certain number of subscribers need to be from income qualified households, or maybe even some kind of support to lower those financial and risk barriers to LMI participation. And so we're hoping to see something like this emerge in Pennsylvania soon, and that's part of why we're having this conversation. We do expect to see either this legislative session, or next year's legislative session, some kind of community solar legislation introduced. There are a lot of groups having conversations and working on this. So this is something to stay tuned for, and I encourage you to stay in touch with us, subscribe to our newsletter, because we will be tracking those and involved in those conversations. That's a great way for you to find out what's happening in community solar in Pennsylvania. And Corey, you can go on to the next slide.
Thanks, Henry. So we got a couple of questions that have come in. We're gonna actually hold those till the end. I'm just gonna finish these slides and then we'll go through those. So let's talk a little bit more about action, right? Things that we can do to prepare a state for pushing community solar forward. When I say education here, I've mentioned this a couple times earlier, but really getting out in the community and talking about what it is, how it works, and who can benefit. Getting that message in front of legislation and during it is really important. And some of those things to consider there is, one, distinguishing how this differs from rooftop and why both are important. Two, equity of access, making sure that people understand this is about bringing solar to everybody in the state. And then three, bringing the benefits of large-scale solar closer to communities. So these aren't big utility scale projects that ship power somewhere else. This isn't a big farm that is on the transmission grid. These are local projects that share benefits broadly among their participants. So having that messaging and have that information out there is really important. Next, building support. Early effective outreach really is a way to create a positive force moving in the direction of community solar. So setting expectations is important, but making sure people understand the timelines to put legislation and a program in place. You want people to be active and to be engaged, but it's also going to be a multi-year process potentially before this program is up and running. And setting those expectations is important to keep people connected and focused on it over that time period. Second is just listening to local ideas and concerns and turning it into positive engagement for the campaign. So that might be a community organization that has concerns about siting solar on the ground. It might be a ratepayer advocate who is concerned about the cost of a program and how it might impact those who are not participating. All of those are opportunities to turn those concerns and listening to those concerns into partners and positive engagement for a campaign moving forward. And then just the simple act of just making a list of every organization you think might want to know about this and taking the time to explaining how it can benefit them and what the prospects are for this to pass. Keeping in contact with people, maintaining contact, and ultimately, staying informed about things as well. We're excited about participating in this in Pennsylvania, and we've done this in other states, and really just providing a kind of a central place to see what's happening and consistently let people understand where we are in the process of bringing community solar to Pennsylvania. So some barriers, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but utility resistance, right? So it's not broad, it's not across the board, and utilities are certainly starting to become more comfortable with community solar, however they define it. But it ultimately, when it's a third-party owned model that's available, is competing with their business model in some ways. So it's important to note that all utilities are not going to have the same viewpoint on this. Municipal cooperatives might be more supportive, but they also might want to own and operate everything within their area. So navigating that is important and kind of being on the lookout for it. Lack of understanding of the benefits. So this is really kind of back into the education, is just making sure that legislators and community members and folks who are involved in the regulatory process understand how a program like this works, why it's necessary, and why it's worth their time to advocate for it or to introduce and support legislation for it. Those conversations have to take place in some cases multiple times for people to really focus and sink in on why community solar is an important part of the solar landscape in a state. And then last, which I mentioned earlier, and I won't spend a lot of time on, is getting ahead of those land use concerns and zoning is really important. And that's something that really takes a little while to prepare jurisdictions. Reviewing zoning codes and thinking about that is not a short process in many cases. So having those conversations up front, encouraging the state to do that as well is really important. Looking for trusted messengers in those areas about potential changes and making it less scary for jurisdictions is a critical component. And last here, before we stop for questions, just some general resources. We're going to be posting this webinar, the slides, and the recording of it on the site. So don't feel like you need to scribble these down, but there's some really great information out there. The second one there, the IREC scorecard, is just a high-level view of all the programs that are out there already that IREC scored to describe the different components of a program and why they're better or worse than other ones. And for folks who don't know, IREC is the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. SEIA is the Solar Energy Industry Association, and CCSA, as I mentioned earlier, Coalition for Community Solar Access. And with that, Henry, maybe if you could just kind of go through the questions and pull out the ones that are relevant, that would be great.
Sure. So we have a question here from Don Kane. What is your strategy to get virtual net metering in Pennsylvania? And I think, Corey, you did address this in talking about how this education and coalition building, and just to add to that, as we talked about through this presentation, there's a lot of different constituencies, a lot of diverse constituencies that could stand to benefit from a community solar program in Pennsylvania. And these are constituencies that may not already kind of be on the on board with supporting solar in general right now, but it does bring benefits to rural communities, to agricultural producers looking to diversify their income stream, to low and moderate income communities, to organizations working on energy burden and energy costs, as well as the kind of traditional environmentalists and general supporters of solar. So there really is an opportunity to bring together these diverse stakeholders and say, we see community solar as something that could benefit all of us, and let's make it happen. anything you want to add to that, Corey?
No, I think that covers it.
Um, and then this is Roger Clark pointed out that Pennsylvania does have something called virtual meter aggregation, which requires all of the meters to be in the same customer name and within 2 miles of each other. And that's right. And while of course that doesn't enable the kind of community solar projects that we're talking about, that is something that does exist in Pennsylvania. Maybe even would have addressed that situation, Corey, you described of the Baltimore apartment owner who owned all these properties but wanted to share the solar production among them.
Yeah, that's a good point actually for Maryland. And in that particular example, there was another meter that he didn't own, so community solar was relevant. But virtual meter aggregation, just important to note there, at least in Maryland, the utility companies in many cases still run those programs. That it exists in Maryland, but they run those billing programs essentially by hand still with spreadsheets because it's just not adopted broadly yet. So that brought up in some of the conversations in the regulatory proceedings of it's difficult to do billing, it's difficult to manage subscriptions and applying virtual credits. You will hear those arguments potentially from utilities, and it's important to be kind of sensitive to the fact that, yeah, there is a cost there for them to implement it, but it's not necessarily something that's insurmountable. It's something that can be addressed with having a conversation about what it might cost for them to put that billing in place and not have it be a barrier to something moving forward in a certain speed, because at the end of the day, it's a billing equation that they should be able to apply. It's really just a question of will and intent of utility to make that happen. So billing questions and concerns, you will certainly hear those.
Yeah, and then Roger Clark had another question here. A municipal utility and an electric co-op in Pennsylvania could do community solar today since they are not covered by the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission rules for net metering. We should be focusing on finding a willing muni or co-op. And that's also a good point. So is it when I said that the state doesn't require utilities to allow virtual net metering, that those rules are just for investor-owned utilities. So your PECO, your West Penn, your Duquesne, those rules do not apply, as Roger pointed out, to rural electric co-ops and to municipal utilities. So they are able to undertake a creative project like this.
Yeah, and we have seen that happen in other areas, and the devil is definitely in the details as far as how the project's constructed, whether it's delivering value to the participants, and et cetera. But the electric cooperatives and munis can certainly do that, and they can be very effective at doing that. So encouraging those types of projects, I think, is important as well.
We have a question here via the chat from Janaha Jones. Just so I'm clear, as a developer in Pennsylvania, I create housing that has solar panels on the majority of properties. In a month's time, the 2 housing developments use less than the consumption it took in. Can I not store the energy and share with others in the area instead of selling it back to the utilities? So this sounds like a question about net metering in general, if I'm understanding this correctly. And so if you wanted to store the energy locally, you would need to install some kind of battery storage. And then you could, then you have energy stored and you can use it later on those properties. Those are expensive, so it does dramatically affect the kind of cost benefit consideration for you. And with net metering, it's almost like you're letting the grid be your battery. So when you produce extra, it goes out into the grid, and you earn those credits for it, which you can apply for to reduce your future energy costs. So it is almost like you're storing the energy and kind of getting the financial benefits of it. We have a question here from Liz Robinson. What are the pros and cons of utility ownership of community solar?
Great question. I think not an exhaustive list, but some of the pros of utility ownership, just in terms of project development, is obviously their ability to finance projects, to create projects at a large scale, cost effectively, and ultimately to deal with billing directly with their customers. I think the cons from our perspective would be a lack of competitiveness, potentially a lack of visibility into how projects are financed, and the potential for maybe a limited type of project models, and certainly no community involvement or ownership of projects and directing kind of where those benefits go, it would be on the cons for us. But I think, constructed well, utilities can certainly have the potential to participate. I just think it can't be at the exclusion of private entities or in a way that is presents an unlevel playing field for businesses.
And I think that's all the questions we have.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody. This was, I think we're right on at 11 o'clock here. Just to follow up, we'll post the webinar recording and the slides and follow up with folks. And please definitely reach out with questions. Henry, I'll let you sign us off here.
Yeah, thanks, Corey, for sharing that information with us. And yeah, as he said, please do stay in touch with us if you have more questions about community solar, if you want to stay up to date with what's going on in the state. Yeah, please, you can reach out to us there at pateam@solarunitedneighbors.org or check out our webpage on community solar, also shown on the slides there. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining.